Please like and subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon to get new video updates.
We're going to talk about the history of the automobile radio. The automobile radio couldn't exist if it wasn't for this activity, the start of broadcasting in 1920. Now, some of you from California will say, no, it was Mr. Harold. Or some of you Canadians will say, no, it was Fessenden in 1906. But we're going to use this pretty much accepted part of time here in November 1920, the beginning of broadcast. And it was a tremendous growth over an 8-year period without any industry to support it. We went from 60,000 homes in the home to 7.5 million sets in the home. So tremendous growth. And inside that growth was a little bit of activity with automobile radio. This is nothing but a pure public event. This is Alfred Gable, who was a pretty major radio manufacturer that all of you are probably familiar with, and he's claiming his entry into car radio. And it was just complete fakery. Here he is sitting with tuning the third stage of a DRF radio with no antenna connected to the radio. So yeah, just a publicity stunt. But there was no activity back in 1927 when this was well published. There's a story that's going around forever and ever and ever that says the birth of the car radio was reported to begin here. This is Riverview Park, Lover's Lane, overlooking Quincy, Illinois. It's a very nice, popular story, but is it true? A little later on, we will see another venture into this story, but we can't ask. The people are all gone. Elmer Wavering, the person who, his beau, sitting here in Lover's Lane, and she says, wouldn't it be nice to be able to listen to some nice music while out here in the car? I don't know what that speaks about Elmer Wavering, but anyways, this is a nice story that this was the beginning. Okay, let's look at some of the characters in our story. This is Paul Galvin. Paul Galvin had a company called Galvin Manufacturing Company, and he built electrical items. He had kind of a rough start, made some bad business choices, fell victim of the Depression era, but nonetheless, he was a very smart individual, hardworking, confident, and a good judge of people. So Paul Galvin was a very important person in our story here. Galvin made battery eliminators. Battery eliminators, of course, the radios of the day were home radios. They ran off batteries, had big B batteries and big A batteries to run the filaments. And people wanted to get away from batteries, so they bought battery eliminators, plugged in the wall, and would run the radio instead of having to put batteries in. But now, the radios are coming out that ran off AC. So battery eliminators are falling by the wayside, even though he had a good product. Just like buggy whips, they were becoming quite obsolete. And so he was looking for a new product line for his failing company. He went to New York City on a business trip one time, and he ran across some people just on the side of the road installing slightly modified home AC sets or battery sets into automobile radios. They weren't doing it well, it didn't work well. He saw they were spending way too much money, way too high a cost, but he was intrigued. So Galvin returned to his home base in Chicago, thinking about what might I do with this idea of radio in your automobile. So he found Elmer Wavering, which we've already been slightly introduced as the man on Lover's Lane, and William Lear. Both were self-taught radio engineers, already experienced in the field, and they took on the task of the three making a suitable radio for automobile use. Lear and Galvin both rented places, manufacturing areas in this building on Harrison Street in Chicago. Lear had a coil company. He built coils for manufacturers of radio equipment, so he knew the business. So Lear then had a buddy of his who was Elmer Wavering, a very capable engineer, and these three people went to work developing an automobile radio. Very specific, start from scratch, designing a proper radio. So these are the problems that they ran up against. First of all, there's no high voltage in the automobile. They needed 200 volts plus maybe to run the plate of the tubes. They only had a 6-volt storage battery. There was no effective antenna, which was going to plague them for quite some time. Lack of overall radio sensitivity was actually pretty easy to overcome in a well-designed radio, but having lots of sensitivity didn't help when you had a bad antenna, you had extreme spark plug noise, you had really bad generator noise. We'll see evidence of that later on. The cars were small. I ride around once in a while in a 32 Ford coupe. And if I have a passenger, we're hitting shoulders. Cars were small, so there's little room to put a radio. So that bothered some of their activity, gave a little bit of work to do. And it had to be universal to work in any car. So this is their first product. It was a TRF design. You can see the classic 3-gain capacitor here, the 3 radio frequency tubes, and down below were the detector and audio stuff. So it was a ruggedized TRF, battery operated of course, and they called it the 5T71. 5 tubes, $71. So here's the radio chassis that had to mount somewhere. The speaker with I don't know why they chose it, an 8-sided speaker cabinet, but I guess that's easier than making round and smaller than square. So anyways, they made an 8-sided speaker cabinet. And this is the control box. This little mounting apparatus here, and then you had on-off or volume control, tuning control that went by what today we think of as speedometer cables from the back of this control around and into the side of the radio. And right here is a key, kind of a novel idea. So to prevent having accidental usage of the radio, unintended usage, or unwanted usage, the on-off switch was a key. So that it kept you from running the battery down, maybe without the engine running. Perhaps something Wavering worried about one on Lover's Lane, I don't know. But maybe that was his contribution. So now they have a design, they have a radio. They think it's working pretty well. When you wanted to let the world know that you had a new product back in the 30s, this is what you did. You went to RMA, Radio Manufacturers Association conventions held every year, and this is where you met the people. You met the suppliers, you met the buyers, you met the people who could help you advertise your product. It was the way to enter the marketplace. So they decided to do that. Unfortunately, he didn't do it well. Galvin took his personal car, equipped with the Lear Wavering improved car radio, went to the 1930 RMA convention. And this is where he didn't do it quite so well. Usually, you did this in advance. You were ready. You had a booth. You had product to demonstrate. You had brochures. You had whatever it took to grab the attention of people. But more important, you had a schedule. You had appointments where you would meet important people. Galvin had none of that. He had no money, no booth, no appointment. He just drove his car up on the sidewalk in front of the entranceway to the convention hall turned up the radio as loud as it would go, and demonstrated the car radio to whoever would walk by and he could get their attention. Well, it worked. He got enough orders to put the new no-name radio into production. Didn't even have a name for it yet, but he did pretty well. Galvin took the name motor from the motor vehicle field, of course, and then he took the term Ola, radiola, Rolla, Victrola, the audio field, and he combined those into Motorola. So that was the name, not of the company, but the name of the product. He had enough issues in business selection and what have you. He said, I'm not going to give up Galvin Manufacturing. Galvin Manufacturing is going to have a product line called Motorola. So that's how the name started. Now let's look at the product. This is pretty interesting. This is what you had to do. You had to mount the radio on the bulkhead. And here's the speaker. Here's the control head. So that's the easy part. Now you had to put the batteries in. And the batteries typically went on the floor, and that was probably the hardest job, because you had to literally get a blowtorch out and cut the bottom out of the floor, make some container for the batteries to sit in, and install the battery boxes. So you had the A battery, you would use the automobile battery, but the B batteries you had to make your own. And they were big. The B batteries were big. They had to last a long time. You didn't want to change them, every week or every 2 weeks, every month even. So the batteries were big, so they would last a long time. In the engine compartment, you had to supply suppressors for each of the spark plugs, and you had to modify the generators, because we'll see that a little bit later. So a lot of work went in on generators, and take that out and modify it. But here was the Achilles heel, if you will. This is the antenna. Underneath the car, you had some insulator here, an insulator here, this triangle thing, I guess, just to get more area. Another spring, another insulator, and then the cable going into the car radio. So that was the antenna. That was a problem. So very quickly, in fact, this is a handwritten note, see addendum. And the addendum was, let's not use an antenna that's underneath the car. Let's put the aerial, nice term, in the top of the car. This was 1930. Most cars, almost all cars, had a fabric top. And that was because you couldn't bend metal by machine and come down and just hit a piece of metal and form a top. You just couldn't do it back then. They didn't have the machinery to do it. The metal wasn't pliable enough. So every vehicle at that time had a fabric top. And the answer was, take a piece of chicken wire and you sew it into the top of the car. So that was part of the 2 days that it took to install the new Motorola into your personally owned vehicle. Obviously, that was a problem with the Roadster. Roadster would have a top that would come down, so they had to stick to some method of making that antenna work. And that was a problem for quite a while. Just take a break away from radio talk for a little bit. 1930 Riders, interestingly enough, had 50 manufacturers of car radios. So I just, you can read this very quickly, and I just put half of them here. And mostly the ones I chose were names that you would recognize. Yeah, there were a lot of people claimed to be in the radio business, but not yet. Galvin did all right. At the end of 1931, he had $287,000 in sales for a net loss, $4,000. And that's not bad for a Depression-era startup business. they were onto something here. However, Galvin still needed money and had to make up for that. So as an advertising stunt, he installed one of his nice fancy new radio in his banker's car, and the car immediately caught fire. So, probably not so good. But the banker must have been impressed because their financial relationship continued. Progress. 1932, 1933 automotive year, Ford announced that they would offer the Motorola car radio as an option. So as you're in the dealer ordering your new Ford, and you're saying, well, let's see, I want a V8 engine, I want wire wheels, I want, car radio? Yeah, check that. I want a car radio. So that's the first time you were able to do that in 1932, 33 model year for Ford. And that was a big deal. Another big deal was B.F. Goodrich, the tire people. They became the first large dealer for Motorola products. And they would take any car and install the Motorola radio. That made Galvin the #1 in car radio sales and profit, and that would continue until 1987. Remember the antenna problem? Here's a fix. They took the spare tire, insulated the mounting bracket from the rest of the car, hooked a wire to the rim, ran the wire inside to the radio, and that was the antenna in 1933. That lasted a year. So anyways, a friend of mine has his car, so I just took a picture of his installation there. A lot of copycats. Here's one from Crosley. They mounted their speaker right in the chassis, but still had the steering column mounted radio. Here's a later Crosley that's in the AWA Museum. And the unique thing about this radio is working. It's a vibrator radio. You turn it on, the vibrator hums, the tubes warm up, and it plays great. And this is turned on every time the museum is open. This is on and working. Just a great old Crosley car radio. Before, you could order a radio from the dealer, from the automotive manufacturer. There were a ton of people selling radios just through department stores. Here's an ad for Macy's department. The radio floor on the fifth floor of Macy's department would sell you an automobile for as little as $29. Of course, you had to install it yourself. But that was, at this era in time, the early to mid 1930s, most people bought their own radio and installed it, or they went to B.F. Goodrich, or they bought a Ford. Interesting enough, looking at how the competition is doing in Europe, I like to look at that when I can. Here's a Europa Supra, a nice two-door sedan, sold by a division called Horny Phone. Boy, it's hard to believe that wasn't copied from somebody. I mean, who would make an 8-sided speaker cabinet besides Motorola? Well, obviously, Horny Phone does. Same steering wheel mounting, same box with a radio in it. So that's what was going on in Europe. We mentioned that U.S. here, right up into the 50s. In Europe, they had long wave radios as well as standard medium wave AM radios. U.S. embraced FM, and Europe still had long shortwave radios. U.S. never had a radio that would do shortwave, never. Except for a little study I did the week before finishing this program, and I found that. That's an extremely rare radio. It's a Philco. It was removed from a 1941-42 Buick. 41-42 cars of any kind are rare because of the wartime effort. They just stopped building cars and obviously stopped building car radios. But this was a 5-band shortwave radio plus the regular medium wave broadcast band. It was just incredible. I'd never heard of that. But it was made by Philco. This may be a prototype, I'm not sure. But I found this and a bunch of information that the Gable Museum just given recently. And that was a ton of information. Now it was one thumb drive that had years and years and years and years of the history of Delco Radio and all of their product lines and what have you. And this was in that folder. That one thumb drive came from Tom Murray, who's one of the world's most well-known automotive radio enthusiast expert. Over the years, manufacturers tried to lure people with different features, if you will. Here's just one list. They had a foot control made by Zenith for Ford. And you're driving along, you want to change radios. Oh, you didn't have to want to reach way over here and push a button, or heaven forbid, turn a knob. You pressed a button on the floor, and that tuned the radio up and down. Push button tuning was very popular, almost mandatory. If you didn't have push button tuning, you didn't sell your product. Tone controls, lighted dials, speed versus volume. Boy, those are problematic. But a little vane somewhere in the bottom of the car or the grill or whatever, as the speed increased, the vane would move. That would turn a potentiometer or something, and it would change the volume of the car. So as the car went faster, the volume got louder. That lasted no time. And rear seat speakers. When I was a kid, I made a lot of money in rear seat speakers. It was the right service at the right time. Very quickly, there was an attempt to make units smaller. They were still big. They were still problematic in trying to install. So here's a company that they started to combine everything. So the tuning controls are no longer separate. The speaker is built in is no longer separate. The radio chassis is no longer separate. So they're trying, but it was a problem. Because look what you had to find. You had to find room, and it had to fit under your dash. So there was a problem. It was a problem needing fixing. And the batteries are still separate. A big problem needing a fix. The batteries just had to go. So here are some things that were tried. A motor generator, a ring charger, low current tubes. So those are some of the things that people worked on to get rid of that big old V battery that was stuck in the car someplace. You find it kind of ironic that what they needed was a battery eliminator. And of course that's what Paul Galvin closed his company with, saying I can't build battery eliminators anymore. So what do? I build car radios that need battery eliminators. This is an Emerson motor generator set. I've only seen one of these. So you put 6-volt DC in, a couple terminals here, the motor ran, the generator ran, and you got 145-volt filtered DC output. And in the box here is filter capacitors, and they showed. That worked okay. It was a little power hungry, didn't solve a lot of problems that way, but they were mildly successful. I've only seen one, and I've done a lot of car radio repairs. This is one that I alluded to earlier. When you install the radio in a 1930s, early 30s car, the manufacturers did nothing to reduce the sparking that would take place on the commutators. They didn't have to. Who cares if they sparked a little bit? Maybe the brushes needed replacing more often, but it didn't matter. Nobody cared about sparking at the brushes. But it was a huge deal with early automobiles. So that little brochure or instruction manual I showed you earlier from Motorola, these were the instructions. Take the generator out of your car. Take the generator apart. Get the right tools, flat files, and start working on the commutator. Open up the brushes. So you had to do that with every one. And so that was problematic, and people didn't like doing that. So what finally replaced the batteries were vibrator power supplies. And they worked quite well. 1934 to 1959 is when the lifespan of battery vibrator-operated power supplies. Interesting enough, there are no good vibrators left today. I used to do a business. I had business doing car radio repair. I was a gearhead. I do a lot of gearheads. I fixed radios for gearheads. And we probably ran into very early was the fact you could not buy good vibrators. Even if they were brand new in a box, they were bad. And the problem was the manufacturers tried to make them quiet. So inside, as soon as you took this cover off, these are all printed on the bottom. When you take this cover off, the first thing you saw was this big chunk of rubber. And that was mounted all around the vibrating parts to keep the noise down. And that's okay, that worked well. Noise wasn't a big objection, but everybody did it because ATR did it, and then Mallory did it, and everybody did it. The problem is they wanted to make that rubber work live and be, not decay over time. So they added, at the time, what was a really good idea, they added sulfur to the rubber. And now here you have these metal contacts with silver or some proper plating on them to work better. And the sulfur attacked the contacts, and brand new vibrators sitting in a box for years, the contacts just corroded and disappeared. And so there are no good vibrators today, even if they're new in the box, they're bad. You can take them apart, clean them, but there's no cleaning left. There's an interesting war going on between manufacturers, and that was the type of rectifier used. It was called the 6X5 OZ4 war. Who was going to sell more rectifier tubes? The OZ4 was interesting. It was a gaseous rectifier, had no filaments, but the 6X4 was its biggest rival, and that had a filament going from pin 2 to 7, like so many other octal tubes. So this manufacturer said, okay, we're going to fix you. Here's a rectifier socket, and boy, you can just barely see it, because here's the keyway, here's pin 1, there's pin 2. Oh wait, there is no pin 2. They didn't put a pin in the socket, so you couldn't wire it through a filament, and you had to buy an OZ4. So the war continued. Noticeable here is the fact that the covers were seen. Vibrators were noisy. They made electrically noise, and you had to shield them. So this had a cover that had to go in here to knock down the noise. But they were good. Today, when we need to replace a vibrator, so many of these aftermarket vibrators, and just have a couple of MOSFETs doing the switching. There's a little IC, not a little hard to see here, that provides the switching pulse and turns the MOSFETs on and off. So they work well. I use one by WJOE radio. And WJOE is not a call sign, it's Joe with a W in front of it. So he makes these vibrators, and they're very good and pretty cheap. When I install these, I put a little metal rod here, so for the tappies, I put a screw in here, and I put this metal rod sticking out just as a heat sink, because these MOSFETs get a little hot to my liking. But if you have an older vibrator radios, they're easily, you can make them work again with these aftermarket solid-state vibrators. Farm radios took advantage of car radios on their innards. So here's a farm radio with a vibrator power supply sitting inside, and you hook it up to a 6-volt battery, and away you go. Before the days of rural electrification and what have you, that was a good solution. Big improvement is coming up. We're getting into toward the later 30s now, and that's to eliminate the 3-part radios and make in-dash radios. So that was the next big improvement. Some were pretty early. This is my buddy's 1934 Ford again. It's a Ford coupe, and What they did was just put a radio in the glove box. The glove box was removed and put a radio in, and you had this great big tuning dial. This happens to be at 1180. That was a nice addition, very rare. But he got one in his 34 Ford. And if you wanted to put your glove somewhere, you threw it in the back deck. They had a huge back deck in the shelf. Lots of room for gloves. You can now, from many different companies, buy a car radio, self-installed, with a kit, everything you need, and it was designed specifically for your automobile. So this is an early Chevy, about a 49, I think. So you can buy this radio, install it yourself, at a price quite a bit below the one installed by the factory. A little surprising that they could make very specific model radios and do it at a price that was competitive. It's been very expensive to build those. I think the key is that the radio is pretty generic, and you just kept on changing front ends. You can lay it sideways, you can make it vertical, and probably with a different head, make the radio fit different models. Oh, here's more examples of early in-dash radios. Anybody recognize that? Very iconic radio. 55 Ford, yeah. This is a 6-volt positive ground radio. The whole rest of the world in 1955 went to 12-volt negative ground. But not Ford. This is the last of the great tube era radios. I just lust over this radio. If I had one in front of me, I'd be hugging it. Push-pull 6V6s, tuned RS stage, selectivity far better than normal. Huge front facing speaker. It's very rugged, worked forever. This happens to be a Buick, but everybody did this. There's a radio in that format. They were just wonderful. These are so good that after the cars were long gone and thrown away, you would see these radios in automotive repair garages and what have you. They'd rip out the power supply, grab a 6-volt transformer, even though it was 60 cycle. The power transformer inside these were a 115 cycle out of vibrators. They just stick 60 cycle into the transformers, turn the radio on, and they were fine. So that wonderful radio, as I mentioned, was the last of the tube radios. So here we are, we're now into 1956, and the biggest development here was hybrid radios. So the first hybrid radio, the reason they went hybrid, or how they went hybrid, was standard tubes like they had been using, requiring B+, but the audio section was made from transistors. So that took quite a bit of power requirement was gone by getting rid of one, maybe two transistors. This particular radio, interesting enough, it was the one only available in a Corvette for this year in 1956 with wonder-bar tuning, signal-seeking tuning AM radio by Telco. So that was the start of hybrid radio. This was a little bit later, only by a year or two, when we talk about hybrid radio, that the first hybrid were transistors, there they are, for the audio output stage, but this one had transistors to replace the vibrators. And so that was the next step in making hybrid radios. It was make 4 or 5 tubes that still needed B+, but how you generated the B+ and the audio section were quite different. So this is a big deal in 1956. Here's a rectifier tube, the 12X4. Why did they put a 12X4 in when all they had to do was put in a couple diodes? And then finally the last attempt at getting rid of, I mean, we're years later. This was Galvin's big deal. We got to get rid of the B batteries, and it took them 20 years to do that. And here's the last gasp of getting rid of the battery And that's, these are all, I didn't know how to introduce this idea, so I just took a picture of myself in my workshop and said, oh, okay, I'll take a picture of these unipotential tubes. These tubes would operate with battery voltage, 12 volts, on the plate, screen, and filament. So unipotential, also called space charge, is how the tubes actually work. But these tubes, these numbers, are all space charge or tubes that would operate at 12 volts on their plate. So that worked to get rid of the B+, but we weren't quite at all transistor yet. And the reason was transistors that would work at FM, 100 megahertz, were still a little iffy in reliability and real iffy in price. So we needed another couple of years before we could go completely transistorized, but at least we got rid of the B+. A long battle and a long term goal. Here, however, 1963 is very typical Motorola AM/FM car radio, fully transistorized, drawing much less power. They did a good thing. They waited long enough to get really good transistors, so this radio worked well. There's one problem left. There's just one more engineering problem left. And you can see it on this radio. It's sticking right out in your face. Well, the problem is, here's how we change bands. See this long bar here? That long bar is pushed to the left right now, and it shows up the AM position. If you push that bar to the right, it'll say FM here, and AM will be covered up. So that's how you did all of the circuit changes inside. You go from AM to FM. But what didn't they have done quite right? Either the bars on the left on those push buttons, and these bars on the right on those push buttons. If this button was pushed this way to show AM, that means that push button and that push button and that push button were AM push buttons. And you push that to the right and FM would show up, and that button would be FM buttons. But they didn't have enough know-how yet to switch push button tuning between AM and FM. So they had separate buttons, AM, 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 FM, FM. More AM stations than FM stations, 3 buttons for AM, 2 buttons for FM. So this is it. This is the last of the big development in radios. So let's stop talking about radios for a minute and talk about other automotive entertainment methods. One, of course, was this thing from Chrysler called Highway Hi-Fi. Unfortunately, Highway Hi-Fi went nowhere. And the problem was the unique record format and trying to get music titles. You couldn't go to any store and buy a record. The problem was the records ran at 16 2/3 RPM. Who did that? Who sat in their office and said, well, I'm going to design a record player for a car, and I'm going to have it go at 16 2/3 RPM. Especially when it's not, there's no 60 cycle you're tied to, because it's battery operated. Here's a later version, however. Somebody came to their senses and made a record player that would use standard 45 RPM records. But it was too little, too late. Motorola came out with this in the 60s, 1960. It was a marvelous radio. Not quite as good as the one you wanted to hog in 1950, but it was a marvelous radio. It was 7 tubes, 15 watts of transistor audio. It was very high performing, aftermarket, underdash unit, and it is highly sought after, collected today. But that kind of the start of the Motorola dynasty, if you will, when Motorola and Delco were, oh boy, they were going at it head and toe. Here's this same unit, the FM receiver, now converted to a FM adapter. In other words, a converter that would convert your standard AM radio into FM. So your antenna went in the radio, You tuned the FM band. The output of the converter was 1200 kilohertz, 1500, whatever it might have been at the time. But a very popular aftermarket accessory was FM tuners. They also came out with something, everybody, I heard a couple, oh, what's that? Actually, I saw one out, there was one on the flea market here. It just blew me away. It's a Vibrasonic, made by Motorola, and it added, they bought these Vibrator reverberation units from Hammond, Oregon, and they put them in cars. And boy, I'm sure you can't see this very well, but this is a very well done explanation of why Vibrasonic, when it's enclosed in your automobile, why it works so well. And it is. It's very cleverly spaced. This speaker is tilted such that sound goes this way, and this back speaker mixes with it right in the front seat, right where the passengers are. It was a wonderfully designed unit. They worked very well. And what killed it? Stereo. When stereo came along, you didn't need this. A companion of mine, if you will, in this automotive business, his name was Olin Schuler. He was a manufacturing engineer for Motorola. He and his buddy worked on this system. It was ready. They were ready to introduce it. They were going out for the final test on the road of this Vibrasonic system. And they had, as Olin described it, a calibrated road. So they would drive over this road, and when they got to this area, if these things operated off stretch springs, so if the springs got moving too much, they'd go boing, and they'd hit something, and you'd hear weird noises. So they had this calibrated road that they drove over, and they said, okay, if we get noise here, that's okay. It should be okay here, no noise. So they're just ready to introduce this product, and they're driving down the road, he and Olin and his buddy Ray, and they turn the corner to get on the road, and they stop, and in front of them is this brand new paved road, smooth as they had to immediately go find another calibrated road to test this system on. So this was Luminar. So you turn on your headlights in the car, and that turned on the lights in the dash. The lights in the dash weren't on all the time, only when it was night. And then you turn the radio on, click, and that put 12 volts in there. So now you have two pieces of data. Dial light on, radio on. If they're both on, lights is good. If you turn one off, if you turn the lights off, and didn't turn that off, the little 12 volt line went to a little noisemaker here, came out the speaker and said, turn off your headlights. Motorola aggressively went after their big rival, Delco, with direct fit radios. You could take any radio, any automobile, and Motorola would look in their catalog, they probably had a radio that would fit in dash. So they went after GM cars and Volkswagen. Volkswagen because that's where the money was, and GM because they were their rivals. I just wanted to recognize these gentlemen that in 2014 they were given the Radio Club of America FM Fred M. Link Award for the work on automobile products. Really nice to see that. William Lear, remember him? He was one of the three triumphant people building the first car radio. He was given credit for the 8-track player. First were built by Muntz for Lear. It's kind of interesting how that was released. Motorola had the exclusive release for that product in the 1966 Ford, where that was introduced. Nobody else could have it that year. It was only in the 1966 Ford. And then in 1968, Philips came out. They said, well, our disc cassette system is smaller, better, and let's start using these in car radios. That was 1968, and that lasted for 42 years. Technical alignment with the head alignment problem was always an issue with the 8-track, even with many improvements. But they would just come on the line. cassette tapes were really a better option. As they say, they lasted until the last cassette was in a 2010 Lexus, and then they were gone. This is a grab-and-go radio, that transistor radio of the mid-60s. Maybe make out a little handle here, and you reach up and grab that handle and pull that radio completely out of the dashboard. So this would be like a docking station, I think we would call that now. So it's a pretty good battery portable and not so good radio combination. But somebody thought that people wanted to grab and go with their radios. But there were issues. Portable was Velco's version. And here's how they did it. This is a 1959 radio, a Delco radio, with the Sportable docking station that was mounted in the glove box. Improved was over this, where there's no push buttons anywhere. This later version had push buttons on the dashboard, even though the Sportable radio did not. Wouldn't need that on a portable. 1959 saw these improvements with push buttons in the dash unit and better portables. These were only made for Buick, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile. You can see Buick here, you can see Pontiac here, and Oldsmobile must be there somewhere. The first in-dash CD player appeared in 1985 and offered improved fidelity over tape. Some cars had multiple CD players that were changers in the trunk. So you go in the trunk, you open up the changer and put in 5 or 6 CDs, and you can play those from the front. In the mid-1980s, this was a popular way to enjoy CDs in almost any cassette player, automobile player. And you just took one of these. Everybody was building portable CD players. They took this adapter, plugged it in the audio output, put that in your, just like you treat it just like a cassette, put it in your player, and it would boom, be pulled in automatically. It was just amazing that none of these seem to get stuck inside the radio. You take the audio out into the head here, and magnetically be picked up by the cassette player head. And you had a pretty darn good radio, pretty good audio. The problem was with these things was a bump caused by jostling. They sit in the front seat of the car and bounce around, and the music would go up and down. CDs may have extended their life with the addition of recording capability. I knew about Nissan Infiniti yesterday at lunch. I was talking to somebody, and they said they had a Toyota Highlander, I think it was, that also had this feature. So you put in your CD, you start to play it, the logic says, boy, I've never seen this CD before, and it lights a button. It says, you want to record this? And if you do, you press the button, on the steering wheel, or however it worked on your radio, and you would record the entire CD. It was remarkable. You start recording a whole CD, driving down the road, it's playing real time, then you pull over, you gotta stop. You turn off the car, you go out, come back, turn on the car, it starts recording, it starts playing again, starts recording again, and it never missed a beat. Never missed where it was recording when you just turned off the car. I just find that amazing. Hey, anybody remember AM stereo? Found AM stereo on my 1989 Plymouth van, whatever that model was. And it, not very good. So Sirius XM radio, probably a huge impact, one of the biggest impact, came on the radio in 2001, followed by Sirius a year later. And these add-on kits were quite popular. I hate slides like this, but it's just a lot of data, so we'll go through it real quick. 1992 digital audio radio service was established by the FCC. The service operated at 2.3 gigahertz. But before you could use that frequency, you sort of had to pay a license. So XM and Sirius paid $93 million and $89 million for an 8-year license to use the digital audio radio service. XM launches 2 satellites, one satellite named Rock, the other one named Roll, in parallel geostationary orbits. Starts broadcasting in Dallas, Texas, and San Diego, California. Not sure why, but then 2 months later they went nationwide. In 2001, Sirius then launches 3 satellites and went live in 2002. Car manufacturers offered satellite radios at option starting in 2002. 2008, Sirius and XM merged into Sirius XM, and then we get to HD radio. And no, it is not high definition radio. So your current AM/FM station could have up to 4 sub-channels, HD 1, 2, 3, and 4. Each sub-channel has different programming, could have different programming, such as news, sports, music, maybe services, such as weather service, road conditions, etc. Also included in the HD radio capability was the ability to send a little bit of video information, such as album cover, artist photos, logos of your company, etc., to your screen. One of the biggest improvements is the improvements in audio quality, because it can take a standard AM channel and the output will be FM audio quality, and FM audio quality will be converted to CD audio quality. So that's a pretty good feature. So most everybody, I say most everybody who has a newer car probably has HD radio built in nowadays. Unlike Sirius XM radio, HD is free, but you do need a special radio for it. There's no worldwide standard. The US and EU are much different, absolutely incompatible. A major advantage in sound quality came from not better electronics, but much better speakers. You can see where they're kind of put them anywhere, right above you, right at your ear level or whatever. And of course they allowed that boom, boom, boom that we all enjoyed so much. 1987, this site in Stockholm, England, the last Motorola car radio was manufactured after years of being a company cash cow. So they stopped building car radios and started building telephones. Except for these guys. These guys sort of had it wrong. Here's a prototype Motorola flip phone with a camera. This is very rare adapter. It's a 40-channel Citizen band receivers in your automobile. Very familiar name by amateur operators, I know, but it's not. It's a very cheap Japanese radio. And then from Chrysler, right to your dashboard, AM, FM stereo, and 40-channel CB radio. That didn't last too long, but there it is. And then this guy showed up, drove into a Hamfest a couple of years ago. This is not junk. Let's stop and find out where these are, and then we'll be done. Elmer Wavering stayed with Motorola for his entire career. Started with engineering, retiring as chief operating officer in '72. He was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame in '89 because of his creating the alternator, replacing the generator, standardizing negative ground, 12 volts at the same time, electronic ignition, and the intermittent windshield wiper. Although there's some controversy about that. And he died at age 91. So let's look at the Galvin dynasty. Motorola founder Paul Galvin became president until his retirement in 1956. He died young, age 64 in 1959. His son took over as president in 1956 and then CEO in 1959 to 86. Robert's son, Christopher, so here we are, 3 generations of Galvins. Robert's son, working his way through the company, became CEO in 1995 to 2003. Then he retired in 2005. So now all the Galvins are retired. Because they're financially kind of successful, They said, let's start something called the Harrison Street Financial Group. So they did that, and they're pretty successful at it. Harrison Street was where Galvin manufacturing was, and where Motorola and all that started. So they paid homage to that. And there it is. Bill there did not stay with Motorola, but instead moved to aviation with an early interest in navigation. He generated 150 patents in the field of radio direction finders, the endless loop recording system that became 8-track, and autopilot systems for both civilian and military. He was named to the National Aviation Hall of Fame in 1978. But he's not remembered for that. You'll remember William Lear, not for his car radio contribution, but for the Lear jet and his multi-million-dollar corporation. And he passed away in 1978. Okay, I like to give people a little bibliography at the end. So if you want to add a couple books to your library, this one, Donald Matheson. Look what he put on the front cover of his auto radio book. Elmer Wade and his girlfriend sitting in a 1932 Ford, the first Ford you could get a radio installed in, and there they are on Lover's Lane in Quincy, Illinois. This is a great book, The Founder's Touch, The Life of Paul Galvin. This has a lot to do with himself, business of the era, and just a very good book about how he ran the company. If you're interested in more detail about automobile, here's a great one on automobile servicing and installation, what have you. Olin Schuller was a president one time of the Anti-Radio Club of Illinois.
Please like and subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon to get new video updates.